Welcome to Shader BFI. My name is Timothy Lattis, and this is the Neo-Kino Graphics channel. Let's start with some dictionary items. APL is the average picture level. It's the average brightness of the image. BFI stands for black frame insertion. This is displaying black or nothing between frames. Flicker fusion. This is the frequency at which a flickering light appears to be steady to a human observer. G to G, gray to gray time. How fast a pixel can transition between states. Overshoot. This is an inverse ghost on an LCD. The panel runs past its target pixel transition. Scan and hold. Pixels update and then hold steady until the next update. Let's start with an analog to a simple GPU filter kernel and talk about two cases: black frame insertion versus scan and hold. For BFI, the eye sees the image, and then it sees nothing. The brain gets the image plus black, so we get a less bright image, but less blur with less strobe time. With scan and hold, the eye is moving, but the image is actually stationary. The brain acts like it's averaging samples across the image, and this is what creates the perceptual motion blur. Shader BFI is thanks to a tech collaboration between Mark, Blurbusters, providing the rolling frame CRT refresh sim base idea, and myself, providing the temporal energy redistribution idea. Originally, I tossed this idea out because Shader BFI doesn't work on bad LCD panels like what I have on my laptop. It did increase motion clarity, but the nonlinear behavior of the panel caused tonality changes, so it wasn't going to work. However, after throwing it up on Shadertoy, I get something on Twitter where Mark says, oh, it actually works on OLEDs. And that was the start of the collaboration. Now, I did try to work around bad LCD panels. If you see below, there's the bad picture of a Shadertoy. On the right-hand side, you have a nice linear gradient, and on the left-hand side, you have something that looks very nonlinear. Because of the pixel switching overdrive and underdrive behavior, I got a loss or gain, and I could not make it perfect. So I gave up on this. Let's talk about some motivations for bringing back motion clarity. First, go to blurbusters.com and explore that. Mark does an amazing job covering every detail you could possibly ever want to know. Here's some of my thoughts. Games, in many cases, are adrenaline amplifiers. Humans in that state naturally experience something called time dilation. This is a heightened state of awareness and clarity, and the mind expects clarity in the direction of eye-tracked motion. Now, if we did 60 Hz on a scan and hold display, it's like variable anisotropic resolution. Your stills are high resolution, but you have poor resolution in the direction of motion, and this kind of contrasts against what your brain wants in the state of time dilation. Let's dive into frame generation. In general, you submit frame n for present, and the driver is going to run an extra pass afterwards to generate m intermediate frames between n-1 and n. So between the prior frame and the one you just submitted. The driver then presents these intermediate frames first, and then afterwards it'll present the one that you presented later. There are some cons. You get visible motion smoothing artifacts in the intermediate frames. The latency increases beyond the slower render rate due to extra GPU work that's done pre-swap. There's also added GPU costs for the frame generation itself and added VRAM consumption. Some people cannot take flicker, like CRT flicker at 60 Hz. Other people cannot take motion smoothing artifacts. Motion smoothing as in the artifacts you see on TVs or graphics cards during the process of frame generation. For me, it provides uncomfortable viewing. I captured some examples off of some marketing material. Next, let's talk about frame generation costs, this time from AMD docs. I typically run something that's at mainstream or below in performance. I don't run enthusiast GPUs to develop on. You notice the frame generation costs on just mainstream, it's higher than my whole frame budget. So frame gen's out from my perspective. Let's move back in time to the CRT era. With VGA CRTs, 90 Hz was beyond good enough. 75 Hz was common, good enough for many people. Note there was a variable refresh rate that depended on the resolution. Often, flicker fusion is very human and brightness dependent, and CRTs are not that bright. NTSC TVs and vintage arcades, typically running at 60 Hz native rate, close to 60 Hz that is, and they had a longer phosphor decay, so you still saw some flicker, but the phosphor decay blended the frames a little bit, and that actually looked pretty decent. However, 30 Hz was scanned 2 times, and that would provide a double strobe effect, and that looked quite bad. Otherwise, the CRT era was awesome. We got all these features of high motion clarity without any work or extra GPU overhead. CPUs had just enough low persistence to have clear eye tracking and motion, and they were dim, and they had tinted phosphor ghost as an unavoidable artifact. Now, the reason for the tinted phosphor ghost is because the decay time of the phosphors changed depending on the color. CRTs, they're already low latency output devices. There's no added frame delay. And CRTs didn't need ultra-high frame rates for clear eye tracking and motion. In fact, there's not really a benefit rendering super high frame rates on CRTs because the phosphor ghost is the same regardless. It's not frame rate dependent. CRTs, of course, are no longer in production, so now what? It's actually worse than out of production. The know-how required to manufacture is completely gone. Now, frame gen doesn't match with what we had with CRTs. However, OLEDs with the fast pixel switching are upon us. What if we tried to simulate the CRT on the OLEDs? First, this is an example from Blurbusters on LCD overdrive. LCDs often have different overdrive settings. Undershooting can yield ghosting and worse pixel switching time, while overshooting can yield faster switching but inverse ghosting. So LCD users need to choose which setting is the most energy conserving for them. Now the good stuff, this one from an OLED review from TFT Central. OLEDs have awesome G to G or gray to gray time fast pixel switching without any overshoot. And now this opens the possibility for temporal energy redistribution. Note, displays typically have 2 kinds of display modes. We have SDR and HDR. In SDR modes, typically brightness is limited to what's possible with 100% white or 100% APL. Sometimes the displays do artificially limit this for marketing reasons. I'd hope they don't do that. However, this is typically closer to a proper dumb studio mastering monitor, which is what we want. With HDR, this is the domain of increased OEM-specific random display behavior. It's like your infant is playing with the display settings. OEMs push limits that they cannot maintain in all cases, leaving unpredictable and display-dependent behavior. Let's dive into some of these HDR issues. Another great example from TFT Central. I would suggest grabbing and reading all these reviews because then you get the complete picture of, the whole monitor. Global dimming typically means tonal scale changes all the time. This is, in my opinion, out of calibration-like behavior, and it makes the displays impossible to target in many ways. There's an example below showing the white luminance and then how it changes with window area. You'll notice it changes quite a lot. Now, zonal backlights, these are now we're moving to LCDs, they have somewhat inverse behavior in some cases to what we're seeing in the OLEDs. As the white window size drops, the display actually gets less bright to avoid blooming and halos. So even if we were to keep a shader target average picture level to try to avoid problems on, say, an OLED, it won't fix our problems with zonal backlighting because, as you see here, as the window size goes down, the peak luminance also goes down. Here's another problem, again from TFT Central. I'd suggest reading the whole review. But a lot of times in HDR, you get random tonal curves. And the random tonal curve depends on, say, average picture level. And basically, as global dimming starts to hit, the behavior at the highlights are very, very different. This out of calibration behavior makes it impossible to target well. So HDR, it's a lot of pain and suffering. Note, advanced color processing requires energy conservation. If you add film grain, you don't want the color grading changes based on how much grain you added. If you're sharpening, you want the positive and negative sides of the ring to cancel to avoid temporal flicker. That means they have to be energy conserving. If you're doing shader BFI, you don't want the energy shift to result in tonal changes. It is impossible to get energy conservation on HDR displays, or at least in HDR modes, because the displays have huge energy shifts based on content. I was showing 3 cases in the prior slides. The right answer, we want a vintage calibrated studio monitor that has no global dimming. Now, some of these displays actually have these modes, the SDR mode, and sometimes you can turn it on and off the global dimming. You notice in some cases, like in this review from TFT Central, the display actually cheated a little bit. If you push it all the way to its peak window APL, you notice it actually puts a tiny bit of global dimming in there. So we can actually work around these cases. We just drop our peak brightness a little bit in software, and we don't hit that target problem. Now, if we look at some non-HDR modes, like SDR mode, this again from a TFT review, you notice if you turn off all the nonlinear stuff, like HDR, etc., the display can act more calibrated. And this is really workable. You notice here, regardless of window size or APL, you have plus or minus maybe 1 or 2 nits. That's fantastic. Thus, we have a workable formula. If we have a display with quick pixel switching, i.e. low G to G time and low to no overshoot, we have something that's going to work. Run the display in its SDR mode, use settings that disable the global dimming, and the user can select whatever gamut they want. Native, sRGB, DCI, P3, anything will work fine. So what about panel BFI? This is another image taken from TFT Central. I'd suggest reading the whole article so you have a complete picture. But typically BFI, or black frame insertion, is often known as ELMB, or extra low motion blur. Sometimes it's not supported, sometimes it's limited to just 1 refresh rate. Typically it's a fixed half-duty square-ish shutter. So you see the example below, it's not really a square wave. It does result in about a 50% cut in brightness. And so there is a big motivation to do it in Shaderland because we can change this. We can make it so that it conserves energy, it won't drop as much brightness. Alright, so let's shift gears and talk about average picture level. Average picture level is often specified as window area percentage. It's talking about how bright does the screen get with a white window filling some percentage of the screen. Surprise, HDR works on many OLEDs only at very low APLs. In fact, you have to be substantially low to get up to anywhere close to the peak brightness. Here's an example again from TFT Central. I'd suggest reading the full article so you get the complete picture. Typically, images have low APLs because it takes a lot more than double the energy to double the perceptual brightness, which means it becomes possible to shift a lot of energy around temporally if we want to. Alright, so here's the simple idea. Temporal energy redistribution. Alright, so this is the temporal analog to the spatial energy redistribution I talked about in my CRT scaling talk. Not going to duplicate that here, just watch the other talk. Alright, so let's do a comparison. This is a very simple comparison between 2 sequences. One is going to be doing scan and hold, and one is going to be doing shader BFI with energy redistribution. Let's say we're rendering at 80 Hertz, and we have an output monitor that is 240 Hertz, and therefore we're basically tripling up the frames. And let's say that our image is under 33% average picture level. If we look at the scan and hold case, you're going to repeat that image 3 times, so you get frame 0, 1, and 2. They're all displaying the same thing. The perceptual midpoint for you as the observer is the middle frame. Now, if we do shader BFI, we're going to take the output energy of frames 1 and 2, and we're going to try to move it to frame 0. In this case, the perceptual frame midpoint shifts to frame 0, so it's effectively like improving 1 frame of latency. Temporal energy redistribution. Basically what we're doing is we're shifting energy towards the first frame of the sequence, leaving black in later frames. We're allowing the overflow in the highlights to progressively spill into the later frames of the sequence. We're effectively trading increased brightness for variable persistence. Mids and darks get much lower persistence and higher motion clarity, where peak highlights behave more like scan and hold and less motion clarity. This has similar behavior to CRTs, where the bright element of CRTs would have a phosphor ghost, i.e. less motion clarity. Alright, so let's talk about the difference between CRT phosphor ghost and shader BFI highlight ghost. In a real CRT, the phosphors decay at different rates, so the ghost is tinted. With shader BFI, there are multiple options besides CRT behavior. We can shift as much per channel energy as possible to reduce the ghosting, and we can leave some amount of tinting. Or we can limit to the same chroma across all the frames in the set. Therefore, we have a little bit more ghost, but no change in the tint. And we can do anything in between. So here's some example of what it looks like. This is showing rolling frame shader BFI on the left side. And then on the right side of the split, we have just a regular image running with scan and hold. So you'll notice on the image on the left side, we have no chroma shift in the highlight ghost, which is denoted by where the arrow is. So it's rolling frames, so part of the frame is very bright and part of the frame is as black as possible. You'll notice that on the left side, no chroma shift, and on the right side where the red arrow is, there is a chroma shift, but there is less of a ghost. So this shader BFI highlight ghost, with typical low APL scene content, is you're not going to get much of the scene in the highlights, so you don't get much of a ghost. Also, for worst case, the shader has another option that you can just drop some of the total energy of the frame. This will allow more energy redistribution and thus trims the ghost brightness. So we effectively have a slider between shader BFI and regular panel BFI with its brightness loss. Let's move on and talk about the type of displays that this could apply to. In my opinion, any display supporting 144 Hz and up, it should be applicable. I know that Mark has seen this at 60 Hz and he thinks it works well there because if you're running with a rolling frame, the rolling frame tends to reduce the flicker that's perceptible. I prefer to run a little bit higher than 60 Hz, just my personal opinion. Alright, so what about memory? Well, if we're burning a 3 deep swap set, or swap chain, at 4K with no BFI, it's going to be 95 megabytes. If we're running, say, 6 frames of BFI, it's going to be close to half a gigabyte. So yeah, if you're at 4K and you're running 6 deep soft BFI, yeah, it's pretty expensive, but otherwise it's really not. So most of the cases where you'd actually be running this, it's actually not too much of a concern for memory. As for shader integration costs, if you're doing integer shader BFI, that means just amplifying from 1 to 2 frames, or 1 to 3 frames, or 1 to 4, and so on. It's actually dead simple and cheap to sell to integrate. You just add some code to the last shader of the game's post-processing chain. The code is going to compute the energy redistribution, and then it's going to write all the extra frames the same time it writes the output frame. One thing to note is GPUs like the ones from AMD that do support DCC on scanout, they will get very good compression on the black tiles. So for instance, the later frames that are almost all black, it's just going to be writing metadata. It's going to be very low bandwidth. So even though there's potentially higher memory, the actual cost of writing that memory is relatively low. And then you just present n frames instead of 1 frame at the end. Just present them right away. And then the other key thing here is to make sure you always hit VSync, because the method depends on hitting VSync to work well. So this is totally safe, right? Okay, we have one problem. The same problem I talked about in my last talk about CRT scaling. If we're doing 1 to 2 ratio stuff, shader BFI is not safe in LCDs. This is due to the temporal static buildup. All right, so the hard idea. This one's from Mark. LCD static buildup. If we do something at an odd rate, such as 1 to 3, the frame or the pixel patterns don't cause static buildup, so we don't really need the workaround. So if we're going to do something that changes every even and odd frame, so 1 to 2 ratio, now we're going to have static buildup. So Mark had a solution for this in his CRT emulation work. He actually simulates a rolling scan of a CRT on a flat panel. And the rolling scan, that breaks up the static. So what I mean by rolling scan is this. Instead of transitioning the frame exactly at a frame boundary, you can allow the frame to transition mid-frame and basically move the transition point over time. Now, where the transition is, you have some amount of a gradient between going full one frame and say dark on the other one, and we can adjust the amount of gradient. So note at the point of gradient, you're kind of going from soft BFI to say scan and hold right at the middle of the gradient. And that gradient point can roll up the screen, say across a few seconds. So this does add some visual latency, but it kills all the static buildup on LCDs. So this is an option for LCDs. Now we can go from integer to full fractional frame rate scaling with the CRT scan. Mark showed that with mid-frame transitions and a rolling scan emulation, we can actually emulate non-integer frame rate scaling. And this is fantastic. You don't really have to hit exactly 60 Hertz. You could do anything you want. The other nice thing is we can change the type of shutter behavior or energy redistribution. All things are on the table. Basically, you have a full virtual display emulation temporally. The example below is showing about a 1 to 5.4 expansion and a very fast step transition. And you'll notice you're seeing different amounts of brightness all in the same frame due to the way that rolling scan works. So with this fractional temporal scaling, it's a little bit harder to integrate. I'm not actually planning on using it just yet, but you can do it pretty simply with this idea, which is that you keep one extra image of temporal feedback, and that temporal feedback becomes an energy reservoir. It basically keeps track of how much energy to carry over, how much energy you've exceeded over what you could display in a given frame. So it's a little bit more cost and bandwidth for this energy reservoir because you have to load and store it each time you output a frame. All right, so let's talk about some working examples. On the left-hand side, you have BF2. BF2 is a black frame insertion. It's just a fixed frame rate doubler as of today. And then on the other side, we have RBF, or rolling black frame, which can do anything from fixed to fractional. These Shadertoy examples are MIT'd, meaning you can use them. The first one is BF2. This I need to extend at some point to support integer multiples of say 3 and 4 and so on. And I'd also need to add back an option for non-rolling frame for displays that can use it. The RBF one, this one is pretty much done. It uses the more expensive energy reservoir method. So if you're going to integrate, I would suggest going BF2 to start, and then if you want something more advanced, maybe try the RBF. Also, a word of warning, these are in the browser because they're Shadertoy examples, and they only work if the browser can consistently hit the peak panel frame rate with VSync. Otherwise, they won't look right. So you notice on Linux, you can have a surprisingly number of high problems getting these to work because a lot of times it's not running at the full rate, depending on how your browser is configured. All right, so another thing we can do, we can mix the temporal energy redistribution with the spatial one. So this Shadertoy is doing DBM, which is the doubling monitor. It does a fixed 1 to 2 by 2 CRT upsample with the BF2, which is a fixed 1 to 2 temporal rolling frame, CRT sim. This is providing an 8x pixel rate scaling at extremely low cost. It's great for getting down to lower end systems, assuming they have a good display. Blurbusters, there is a beta of Test UFO, And this one has the first CRT electron beam simulator. This is Mark's version of the rolling frame variation. It's live. All right, so what about user settings? How do we expose this stuff? All right, so here's an example of user settings, something you might use for integer shader BFI. First, we would have an SDR HDR display mode. We want to configure SDR when we're running shader BFI. The next, we'd have a gamut choice, whether you want standard or wide gamut. The next thing we'd have is like a gamma choice, meaning an adjustability of gamma on the image to try to correct for nonlinearities of the panel. And then maybe an sRGB enable to toggle forced sRGB mode instead of using the gamma adjustment. And then when it comes to shader BFI, we'd have a few options. One, a toggle to enable. And then if we enable, this should force it into SDR mode. And then a selection of the number of black frames for, say, the integer shader BFI. I would just disable what would be under 60 Hertz, not, to make it so that the user isn't expecting it to work at, say, 24 Hertz. Then we'd have a brightness boost from 0 to maximum. So if we do 0, we're getting close to what the actual displays would have. If we do 100%, we're getting full energy redistribution. And then a ghost chroma preservation option, where you can go from 0 to less ghost, to 1, which is more ghosting but no tinting in the ghost. And then an OLED versus LCD option. Remember, the LCD needs the anti-static if you're doing one frame BFI. And then an anti-static cleaner speed, which is how fast should we clean up this, how fast should it roll across the screen in the cleaner. And that's about it. All right, so many are going to say this needs complex display configuration. Yes. The gamer probably needs some instruction on how to make it work right. Now, if the overlords get scared about this, you can always put it on a secret menu. Just like in and out, the best stuff is not on the regular menu. Well, that's the end for now. If you want to do this in your project, feel free to contact either Mark or myself. I think both of us would love to see it with a good integration of just about anything. Take care.